Right, so we've all heard about this Tesla takedown thing going on,
Yeah.
like Global Day of Action, I think they were calling it. Happened on Saturday, March 29th, 2025. And I think when you hear something like that, you maybe picture like a handful of protests, maybe something relatively small. But
This was way bigger. This was hundreds of demonstrations, and not just at like a few locations. We're talking over 200 Tesla locations across the entire U.S. And it wasn't just the U.S. either.
no, it went international, right?
Yeah, big time. They had actions happening in Canada, all over Europe. So this is a pretty big coordinated, kind of a pushback against something.
And that something seems to be really focused on Elon Musk, specifically his position as the head of the Department of Government Efficiency,
Yeah, DOGE, they're calling it.
DOGE, under the Trump administration. And it seems like it's also about all the policy changes that are coming out of that department.
Yeah, right, exactly. So for this deep dive, you've given me quite a collection of sources here. We've got a bunch of news articles, Fox News, CNN, Associated Press, Chicago Tribune. And then kind of rounding it out, we've got these compiled briefings that are focusing on the Tesla takedown events themselves.
So what we're going to try to do today is really dig into this whole thing. Why were these protests happening? How big were they really? How did everyone react? Musk himself, law enforcement. And then, what does this all mean? What are the implications of this whole Tesla takedown? So I guess the first question is, what was the spark? What really kicked this whole thing off?
Well, the main thing was just people being opposed to Elon Musk running this new department, right? The DOGE.
Right, but it wasn't just him being there, right? It was the policies he was putting out.
Exactly. So what we saw was huge cuts to federal government staff. Budgets were slashed. There was a big push to get rid of a lot of regulations and basically just shrink the entire federal workforce. And a lot of people were really worried that these changes were too much too fast and that they're going to do a lot of damage.
And then on top of that, there was also the accusation that Musk wasn't being honest about federal spending.
Right, which just adds fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
People are already on edge, and then you get that kind of accusation thrown in. It's a recipe for unrest and protests.
So yeah, we've got Musk and these government cuts, but what were people actually saying they were mad about? What were the specific complaints?
Well, there was a whole bunch. One guy, James DeCurd, I don't know if you saw that quote.
Yeah.
He was talking about how he was afraid the country was turning into a dystopian hellscape because of these cuts. I mean, that's pretty intense, right?
Wow, dystopian hellscape. That's a pretty strong image.
Yeah. And, people were also really upset about specific agencies that were being targeted. There was that whole thing about trying to shut down the United States Institute of Peace.
Yeah.
And then there was the proposed cuts to the IRS staff.
Yeah, I saw something about that, 20% cuts.
Huge. And you know what that means, right? Less people to collect taxes, less people to go after tax cheats. So people were obviously worried about that.
Yeah, especially someone like me. I mean, you know how important a functioning tax system is to everything. What else? What were some of the other hot button issues?
Research funding was a huge one. People were really worried about cuts to the NIH. And we're not just talking numbers here. There are real people affected by this. Like that story about Melanie Yarn. Her nephew works at the NIH doing Alzheimer's research, and his funding got cut.
So that's research that might not happen now.
Exactly. And it wasn't just Alzheimer's. People were also concerned about cuts to research for other conditions. Like Ed Grass, for example. He's got muscular dystrophy. And he's worried about what these cuts mean for the future of research for chronic illnesses.
Yeah, I mean, if there's less research, that means fewer treatments and therapies being developed. It's scary for people who are relying on that research.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just domestic issues either. People were really worried about the global impact of these policies. Like the whole thing about freezing foreign aid and dismantling the agencies that distribute that aid.
Yeah, I read about that. There were people who work for those agencies that were laid off, right?
Right. Todd Post and Laura Playa. They were talking about how these cuts are actually having a devastating impact on people in other countries, like women losing access to HIV treatment. It's a pretty dire situation.
Yeah. That's really serious. And those laid off federal employees, they must have been a big part of the protest too, right? I mean, it's their jobs on the line.
Of course. I mean, people were losing their livelihoods.
Yeah.
Melissa Nussin was talking about how her neighbors got laid off because of the DOGE cuts and they had to sell their house. Todd and Laura, the ones that we just talked about, they lost their jobs too. So it's real people, real families being affected by this.
Yeah, you can see how that would make people angry and scared.
Right. And beyond those really practical concerns, there was also this idea that Tesla itself had become like a symbol of all of this injustice.
Really? Like the cars themselves?
Yeah, people used to think of Tesla as this cool, innovative company. But now, because of Musk's involvement with the Trump administration, it's kind of become this symbol of everything people are protesting against.
Interesting. So it's not just about the policies anymore. It's about what Tesla represents.
Exactly. And it wasn't just domestic policy either. People were also upset about some of the things Trump was doing internationally, like those tariffs he put on Canadian goods. And some of the stuff he was saying about Canada, a lot of that was seen as being influenced by Musk.
So he's kind of like a puppet master.
That's how some people see it. And then there was also just this general feeling that Musk's personal values are out of step with a lot of Americans, like Marisa DeLine, for example. She was saying that she thinks Musk is using his power and wealth in a way that's actually harmful to society.
So a lot of different reasons for people to be upset. Okay, so let's move on to the protests themselves. What did they actually look like? How many people were there? Where were they happening? Give me the details.
We know that there were over 200 protests planned at Tesla locations all across the U.S., and their goal internationally was to hit 500. So pretty ambitious, right?
Yeah, 200 in the U.S. alone is pretty huge. Can you give me some examples of what they were doing? Like, were there any protests that really stood out?
Sure. So in Georgetown, D.C., they had this thing called the Tesla Takedown Dance Party. Over 100 people showed up with anti-Musk signs, and they were dancing to disco music outside a Tesla showroom. And get this, people were driving by honking their horns in support.
A dance party protest? That's pretty creative.
Yeah, definitely not your average protest.
Yeah.
And then in Arlington, Virginia, they had a protest with over 150 people focused on healthcare and foreign aid. And in Rockville, Maryland, there was a massive protest with like 750 people. Boston had hundreds of protesters, too. So the East Coast was definitely a hotbed of activity.
Sounds like it. What about other parts of the country?
Oh, yeah, it was happening everywhere.
Yeah.
Chicago had a big protest with about 200 people. And they had some pretty intense signs there, like, "We don't want your swastikas." And they were even putting up pictures of Musk next to Hitler. There were reports of people cheering when cars honked in support and booing Teslas that drove by.
Yikes.
Yeah, and in Seattle, you had Representative Pramila Jayapal actually speaking at the protest. So you can see how this is starting to get really political.
Yeah, a congresswoman showing up, that's a big deal. What about other states?
They were all over: New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, Minnesota, Texas, you name it. They even had protests in places like Indianapolis and Cincinnati and all over Virginia, Pennsylvania, Colorado. So truly a national movement.
Okay, so nationwide. But what about internationally? What was going on in Canada and Europe?
Well, London had a protest outside a Tesla dealership with maybe a couple dozen people. They were holding signs and people were honking in support. And then in Edmonton, Canada, they actually had a protest the week before, specifically about Musk's influence on Canadian policies. And then in Germany, there was this crazy incident where 7 Teslas were destroyed in a fire near a dealership. It's not clear if it was related to the protest, but it's definitely suspicious. Berlin also had a protest as part of the Global Day of Action. So even though the numbers were smaller internationally, the message was still spreading.
So a truly global movement. What were people actually doing at these protests? Like, how were they getting their message across?
Pretty standard protest stuff.
Yeah.
Lots of signs. Some of them were funny, like honk if you hate Elon. Others were more serious, like fight the billionaire oligarchy. And then some were just mean like Porsche fast, Ferrari faster, Tesla fascist.
Yep.
Right. And of course, there was a lot of chanting, hey, hey, ho, ho, Elon Musk has got to go, that kind of thing. And then they were also encouraging people to boycott Tesla, like telling people to sell their cars and not buy Tesla stock.
So hitting him where it hurts? In the wallet.
Exactly. And it's important to point out that there were also counter-protesters at some of these events, so it wasn't like everyone was on the same page.
So a bit of a mixed bag. Okay, so we've talked about the protests themselves, but there's also this other element here, right? The violence and vandalism.
Yeah, and it's important to be clear here. The organizers of the Tesla takedown were very clear that they wanted peaceful protests. No violence, no vandalism. But unfortunately, there were some pretty scary incidents that happened around the same time.
Like, what actually happened?
Well, the worst one was in Las Vegas. 5 Teslas were set on fire and shot at. The police said it was a targeted attack. So this wasn't just random vandalism. This was someone trying to make a statement. And then on top of that, there were reports of vandalism at like 10 other Tesla locations across the country. From Oregon all the way to Massachusetts. People were spray painting cars, messing with the charging stations. It was pretty bad.
So that's a pretty widespread pattern of violence, specifically targeting Tesla.
And the FBI took it very seriously. They created a whole task force to investigate these attacks. And the Justice Department even called some of them domestic terrorism.
Wow, domestic terrorism, that's serious.
Yeah, and they actually arrested a guy named Paul Kim in Las Vegas for the arson and vandalism. And when they arrested him, they found that he had spray painted "resist" at the scene. So it definitely seems like there was a political motivation there.
That's crazy. Were there any other incidents like that?
Yeah. A supercharger station in San Diego was vandalized. Someone burned a Cybertruck in Seattle. And then remember that fire in Germany that destroyed 7 Teslas? Well, we don't know for sure if it was connected to the protest, but it definitely adds to the overall picture. And then there was even an incident in Watertown, Massachusetts, where a pickup truck hit 2 protesters with its side mirror. Thankfully, no one was seriously hurt, but still pretty scary.
Yeah, that's a lot of violence and destruction. And, Tesla wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. They actually told their customers to use their car's Sentry mode to record anything suspicious.
Right, which is basically a built-in security system.
Mm-hmm.
So they were definitely worried about something happening. But again, it's important to remember that the Tesla Takedown organizers had nothing to do with any of this violence. They repeatedly said that they wanted peaceful protests and that they condemned any kind of vandalism or attacks.
So it sounds like they were trying to distance themselves from that element. Okay, so we've talked about the protests and the violence. Now let's talk about how people reacted. Starting with Elon Musk himself, what did he have to say about all this?
Well, he had a lot to say. He went on record saying that being in the government with DOGE was actually bad for him and his businesses.
Really?
Yeah, he said that his companies were suffering because of it. And he specifically pointed to the vandalism, saying that it was hurting sales. Do you think it helps sales if Tesla dealerships are going to be firebombed?
Okay, so he's blaming the protesters for hurting his business.
Yeah, at least partially. But then he also tried to reassure his employees, saying that Tesla was going to be fine. He told them to hold on to their stock and that the future was incredibly bright.
He's trying to project confidence.
Yeah, and he also called the vandals psychos.
So not exactly mincing words. Okay, so that's Musk. What about the police and the FBI? How did they react?
Law enforcement was definitely on high alert. I mean, the FBI created a whole task force to investigate the violence. And both FBI Director Kash Patel and Attorney General Pam Bondi were using the term domestic terrorism to describe some of the attacks. Assistant Director Ben Williamson actually went on TV to talk about the task force and how they were working with the ATF to investigate these crimes. So they were taking it very seriously.
So a very coordinated response from law enforcement. What about the public? What were they being told?
Well, they were basically told to be on the lookout and to report anything suspicious. See something, say something, that kind of thing. They really emphasized that they needed the public's help to prevent these kinds of attacks.
And we also saw some politicians getting involved.
Oh, yeah. Representative Pramila Jayapal was at the protests in Seattle, and she even gave a speech. And Representative Jasmine Crockett was encouraging people to keep protesting. So definitely some political support for the movement.
So it's not just regular people who are upset about this. Okay, so last question. What does this all mean? What's the big takeaway from this whole Tesla takedown?
Well, it's a really complicated situation. But one thing is for sure. This is a huge challenge for Tesla. Their stock price has dropped by 45% since December 17th. People are talking about selling their Teslas. Sales are down in Europe, so it's definitely having an impact.
Yeah, those are some pretty big warning signs for the company.
And, for a lot of the protesters, this wasn't just about Tesla. It was about their opposition to the Trump administration. Some people were even calling it the Musk-Trump regime. So you can see how these things are all connected in their minds.
It's like business and politics and technology are all mixed up together now.
Exactly. And then there's also that whole issue of the violence. It's really unfortunate that these attacks happened. And it raises some important questions about how to keep protests peaceful and prevent them from being hijacked by extremists or criminals. The FBI getting involved and calling it domestic terrorism really shows how seriously they're taking this.
So a lot to think about. Okay, so to wrap this up, the Tesla takedown was a big deal. Hundreds of protests, lots of anger at Elon Musk and his policies, and some really scary violence mixed in. It's definitely a sign of the times.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what happens next? Will Tesla recover? Will this kind of activism become more common? How will technology and politics keep influencing each other? I think these are questions we're going to be grappling with for a long time.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there, we really encourage you to learn more about this whole situation. Read the stories of the people who are being affected by these cuts. Think about what it means for the future of technology and government. There's a lot at stake here, and it's important for all of us to be informed and engaged.
Definitely. And remember, this is just the beginning. There's a lot more to come.
Okay, folks. Thanks for listening to this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another one. Stay tuned.